The Greeks were terrified of Hades, not the underworld, mind you, the god himself, and for one specific reason that your modern pop culture retellings always seem to leave out. You were not supposed to say his name out loud. This was not some silly superstition. It was doctrine. To speak the name of Hades in ordinary life was to invite his direct attention. And his attention, the ancient Greeks believed, was the absolute last thing any sensible living person wanted to attract. Walter Burkert, the Swiss scholar of Greek religion whose 1977 work remains the foundational text in the field, documented this taboo in painstaking detail. You see, the Greeks did not fear death as some grand, poetic abstraction. They feared the god who administered it, much like a modern bureaucrat fears an unexpected audit. What replaced his name was a clever little euphemism, Plouton, the rich one, because the earth swallows everything eventually, and beneath the mud lay all the wealth of the world, the grain, the ore, the roots of every living thing. It was a blatant compliment, designed to flatter someone you were absolutely certain was listening. That nervous little substitution tells you everything about how this worship actually worked. There were no grand, beautiful temples to Hades in ancient Greece, not in Athens, not in Corinth, not in Sparta. There is exactly one documented sanctuary of Hades that functioned as a genuine cult site. And it wasn't even in Greece proper. It was in Elis, in the western Peloponnese. And according to the geographer Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era, this sanctuary opened its doors to worshippers exactly once a year. One single day. One priest entered. No one else. Even that poor priest was required to undergo heavy ritual purification before crossing the threshold, because a space dedicated to Hades was categorically different from a space dedicated to any other god, because Hades was not a god you visited with gratitude or hope. You went to him when you had absolutely no other choice. The ancient Greek religious system divided the divine world into two very distinct registers. The Olympian gods, the loud, flashy ones with public festivals and athletic competitions held in their honor, received offerings called thysiai. These were upward offerings. The altar fire sent smoke rising into the sky toward gods imagined as resident far above. But Hades and the Chthonic deities, the quiet ones whose domain was below the dirt, received a categorically different type of sacrifice. They received enagismata. The blood did not rise, it fell. Ancient sources describe offerings poured directly into pits dug into the earth or into convenient cracks in the ground near areas associated with the underworld. The sacrifice went down, not up. Even the basic vocabulary of ancient Greek cult practice treats Hades as structurally inverted from everything that orbited Olympus. The scholar Sarah Iles Johnston, in her 1999 study, traces the mechanics of this chthonic ritual in extraordinary detail. What she found is a bit uncomfortable. The Greeks distinguished not just between the living and the dead, but between the properly dead and the improperly dead. Someone who died young, violently, or without a proper funeral became an aoros, a premature one. And these tragic figures were considered actively dangerous to the living. They had not completed the correct passage. They hovered, and managing them required a specific, deeply tense negotiation with the boss himself. This is where the practice of defixiones enters the record. Defixiones were curse tablets. They have been found all over the Greek world, in graves, in wells, at crossroads, in sacred springs. These were simple lead tablets inscribed with the names of enemies, rivals, unfaithful lovers, and business competitors. Human pettiness is truly timeless. They were folded or rolled, frequently pierced with iron nails and dropped into sites believed to be access points to the underworld. Some were addressed not to Hades directly, but to his court, to Persephone, to Hermes in his role as guide, or to the Unquiet dead themselves, who were effectively recruited as supernatural enforcers. What the Depicciones reveal is a massive system of popular religious practice operating entirely outside the official temple cult. Ordinary Greeks, not priests, not holy initiates, were regularly attempting direct correspondence with the underworld, and they were never asking for blessings. They were asking for harm. Here is what the lonely sanctuary at Elis and those nasty little curse tablets share. Both treat Hades as a purely transactional entity. He was not a god of death in the romantic modern sense. He was not a judge of souls in any moral framework resembling justice. He was simply a cosmic bureaucrat who held something you desperately needed, either the safe passage of the dead or the power to compel them. And he could be approached only with extreme care through carefully circumscribed ritual, with offerings that acknowledge the inversion of the living world rather than celebrating it. The Necromanteia at Acheron, near the river in northwestern Greece, operated on exactly this logic. The Acheron was one of the rivers believed to border the underworld, and the ritual complex built at its source, excavated in modern times by archaeologist Sotiris Dakaris beginning in 1958, was a consultation site for the dead. This is what actual Hades worship looked like. The Eleusinian mysteries complicate the picture a bit further. The mysteries, held annually at Eleusis outside Athens from at least the 7th century before the Common Era, until their aggressive suppression by the Christian Emperor Theodosius in 392 of the Common Era, centered entirely on the myth of Persephone's abduction and return. The specific content of the initiation was kept under penalty of death, and remarkably, no initiates broke that oath in any document that survives. But the structure of the ritual, reconstructed from architectural evidence and initiate testimony, points clearly toward one central operation. The initiate was made to experience, in a visceral and symbolic way, the journey into the domain of Hades and the return from it. The scholar George Milonas spent decades excavating Eleusis, publishing his findings in 1961. What the physical evidence shows is a processional route that terminated in the Telesterion, a vast, shadowy hall capable of holding several thousand people, with a central shrine called the Anacteron, to which only the highest initiates were ever admitted. The transformation the mysteries promised was not moral, it was existential. Initiates who survived the rite reported something that contemporary observers described as a removal of fear, not the fear of dying, the fear of what awaited them in Hades's domain. The mysteries made Hades navigable by making him familiar. But outside Eleusis, outside the sanitized official civic cult, what the Greeks actually did with Hades is considerably darker. The magician's papyri, assembled and translated by scholar Hans-Dieter Betz in 1986, contain explicit invocations of chthonic power that call directly on Hades by multiple secret names. This includes the pre-Greek name Ereshkigal, borrowed directly from Sumerian tradition, where she was the ancient queen of the underworld. You could compel someone to love you using Hades's name. You could utterly destroy a business rival. You could invoke a recently dead person to relentlessly haunt someone who had wronged you. What this means is that Hades existed on two entirely different registers in Greek life simultaneously. In the official polite theology, he was the absent king, never on Olympus, never visible, never interventionist. The popular myths assign him almost no narrative function outside the abduction of Persephone. The Iliad barely mentions him. Even in tragedies that deal with death extensively, Hades appears not as an actor, but merely as a place, an atmosphere, a final destination. He is conspicuous by his narrative invisibility, but in the popular gritty religious practice, the cursed tablets, the Necromanteia, the magical papyri, the Chthonic offerings poured into the dirt, Hades was intensely present. He was the most frequently invoked entity in the entire underground tradition of Greek religious life, not Apollo the healer, not Zeus the father. Hades, whom you could not name in polite company, was apparently on excellent terms with anyone desperate enough to call on him correctly. That is the version of Greek religious history that the standard textbooks love to erase. The civic religion, the pristine temples, the festivals, the state sacrifices represented the Greek relationship with the divine as ordered, hierarchical, and publicly legible. But beneath it ran something older and far less tidy, an underground tradition in which the god of the dead was not absent or dormant, but available and regularly contacted by ordinary people who needed something the living world simply could not provide. The Greeks did not worship Hades despite their terror of him. They worshipped him because of it. Every civilization in human history has done exactly the same thing. The gods, with the absolute most power over outcomes they could not control, became the ones they could never stop thinking about. Hades held the one outcome that applied to everyone without a single exception, regardless of virtue, status, or wealth. He was not the god they ignored because he frightened them. He was the god they could not afford to ignore, precisely because he did.